Hello, welcome. We've been talking about justice. Let's do a little bit of a recap, shall we?
Big subject.
The way we approached this subject was to try to get a grasp of what justice was at its most abstract level. That is to say, as a cosmic principle that always operates. We mentioned that different cultures have different concepts for justice, like Ma'at in Egypt, Karma in India, Justitia in the West, that comes from Latin. And we wanted to try and understand what justice was in its essence. That is, justice that operates with or without institutions that mediate or implement justice. So we need to answer that question before we can answer specific questions like what would be just in this situation? How do we apply justice to such and such a set of circumstances? Then we began by looking at the human project, which I described as a spiritual program to bring about a harmony of thought and action. That would be one of the effects of it. Because we find that we are both thinking beings and acting beings. And when the two are working together, we have what you might call contemplative living, where there is a level of self-awareness, but at the same time engagement with the flow of life. Remember, we said that whilst there is always that tendency for us to want to step outside of life and witness the events of life, because we are, after all, choice makers, and in making a choice, we're making a deliberation. And that seems to require some sort of space. We don't have instinct that operates automatically like an animal. So choices take time. But even when we think we are stepping outside of the flow of life, or the metaphor that I used was the merry-go-round. We step off the merry-go-round and we think we'll catch it on the next revolution or the revolution after that. And in the interim, we are sorting out our life's problems. It's not that simple, because life continues and carries us in its flow. It carries us in its flow, and there are choices that we are making all the time. And even when we think we are not making choices, we are choosing by default. Everything's an opportunity cost. If we're not making choices, we're allowing circumstances and other people to make choices for us. So we can't get out of life, and yet we are endowed with this reflective, choice-making consciousness. So, having introduced thought and action, we then narrowed down and talked about action. We mentioned that every one of us acts on the world, and in doing so we are engaged in a protracted experimentation. We act on the world to try and have some effect, because we all seek control to some degree, and we talked about the difference between reasonable control, appropriate control over one's life circumstances, and megalomaniacal, magical control that some people imagine they can wield. Just looking at normal control, we attempt to act on and influence the world, and then we get some feedback from the world to tell us how well our model of how the world works is confirmed or is rejected, corrected by the feedback that we get. So there is a kind of a cybernetic system that exists between self and the world. We are constantly acting on the world, and then we're getting feedback from the world. And I describe this action and reaction as one movement. And the reaction or totality of the consequences of our actions I described as our experience. So on the one hand we have experimentation, on the other hand we have experience. And I suggested that that experience that we harvest, that we sow from the actions, that we reap from the actions that we sow, is justice. And justice is a corrective to all of the actions that we take, which aren't clear, coherent, which may betray unbalanced desire. Because not every action is taken in freedom, is it?
No.
And then we have to consider what we mean by freedom. Because everybody wants to be free, and we all seem to hold freedom as a value.
Sure.
But there are different concepts of freedom, as we've talked about in the early days of this channel. There is freedom which is a kind of libertarian freedom, which is anything goes sort of freedom, which can be more like license in a lot of situations than true freedom. What do I mean by license? Is it really freedom to do whatever you want, to act on any impulse, to yield to any destructive emotion, to exact vengeance whenever you feel like it? Is it freedom to be a slave of your lusts and to perpetrate degradation in the world? Is it freedom to exploit, take advantage of other people when you can get away with it? You see the problem. If we define freedom as doing whatever you want, then there's going to be a lot in such actions that is going to need correcting, and there's going to be a big justice backlash from that.
Yeah, because you're impinging on other people's freedoms.
You are impinging on other people's freedoms.
I want it this way.
And some time ago, we tried to marry up rights and duties, because whenever you have a right, it imposes a duty on other people to respect that right. For example, if you have a right to free speech, that's a freedom that we seem to value, but that imposes an obligation on other people not to interfere with that, not to censor you, or not to punish you for exercising that right. If you have the right to own property, let's say, then everybody else, including the society around you, has a concomitant obligation not to steal your property from you. So the rights and the duties tend to work together. And these in turn reflect the double vectors of freedom. What do I mean by that? Well, freedom can be understood as freedom from and freedom to. This takes us back to the early days of the channel, and I have laid this out before. When we are, I think it was in relation to religious freedom we were discussing this. But when I say freedom to, I mean, freedom from, this first vector of freedom. The vector that the libertarian grasps, very good at grasping this first vector, but not good at understanding the second vector. This first vector is not really contentious. It means freedom from coercion. That's what freedom from means. It means there's no force on you to act in a particular way. You are not compelled. There's no gun held to your head. So you're neither compelled by other people, other individuals, or by the state. So if there's, in the absence of coercion, one has freedom from. And if one is going to limit the freedom of an individual, then one has to have very good rational grounds and grounds in justice in order to do that. For example, to prevent harm to other people. That would be a basis for stepping in and limiting somebody's freedom from coercion. Now, the other side of freedom is the vector freedom to, because when you're free, you can do anything, as I say, but you shouldn't do anything. Some things, the indulgence of vices and activities which are destructive to self and to others, vitiate freedom, turn freedom into something that it's not. Something more like license or enslavement to passion or degradation. So the freedom to means freedom to follow what I've called the moral law. So true freedom operates along with order and morality. And you can't have it otherwise, really. So the moral law is understood to be built into our conscience. There is an innate sense of right and wrong, a voice that tells us right from wrong. That's within ourselves, and that's called the conscience. The proponents of natural law theory believe that there is this sense of right and wrong, and people can know naturally, because it's innate, it's in their nature, to be able to distinguish the moral law. Now, religious traditions are supposed to expound the moral law and fortify the moral law and confirm that voice of conscience within. They don't always get it right, but that's what they're supposed to do. So they're meant to be a kind of a bulwark to protect the moral law and to keep people on track in exercising their freedom. And so when you act according to the moral law, again, which is supposed to be supported by the religious traditions, and it is supposed to be supported by the institutions of the political community, then one is acting justly, and one has nothing to fear from the operation of justice and from the consequences of one's actions. But if you don't regulate yourself, you'll end up being regulated externally. And this may happen through institutions of the state. It may happen through the circumstances that befall one. And we even mentioned last time that sometimes nature regulates us because of the upheavals that happen on the planet. In some sense, they could be a backlash for our wrong ways, our unjust ways of living, our depredations of the earth and so on. The hurricanes, the cyclones, the fires, the droughts. We can lament these situations, but we don't always join the dots between what's caused them and then the harvest that we reap. In the case of drought, the harvest that we don't reap. I have mentioned before that when religions themselves don't check their adherence, or when in the name of religion a group of people gets persecuted, it falls to the role of the government to intervene and enforce the moral law, which is justice again. But in order to do that, the government itself must have a firm grip on the moral law. And a simple rule of thumb for understanding how this moral law works is the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But also elaborated from the biblical tradition, the love of God and the love of neighbour. By loving God, we acknowledge that the source of all freedom comes from God's freedom and God's sovereignty. And the free will in us is a reflection of the will of the Creator, sovereign over the universe, in the sense that everything that happens within the universe happens either because the Creator wills it or the Creator permits it. And then the love of neighbour, on the other hand, its implementation in social life means that we exercise our freedom and we certainly claim our rights, but there are duties that go along with the invocation of rights. And there are duties that fall to us, and then there are concomitant obligations on other people. What do I mean that there are duties that fall to us? Well, if you think of any right, the right to life, we exercise it. But it means that respecting and caring for life, we have a duty. The right to free speech, let's say, if we're going to exercise that right, we have a duty. Let me just distinguish what we have to do from what others have to do by calling what others have to do their obligation to us. If we exercise the right of free speech, we have the attendant duty of making sure that we don't peddle mistruths, that we don't slander other people, that we don't falsify evidence. In other words, that we use our capacity to speak and communicate honestly and truthfully. If we have the right to assemble and protest something or make a political point, we must also carry out our duty to do that in a peaceful way, in a non-violent way, respecting persons and property. In fact, this transmission is going out on it's being recorded on the 2nd of October, which is the International Day for Non-Violence. And this day is picked because it is the birthday of Mahatma Gandhi, who was a big pioneer of the principle of non-violent civil disobedience and resistance. It's how we carry out our protest that's really important. So this is a way of bringing the right and the duty together. And certainly Gandhi maintained that non-violence is potentially more powerful than the mightiest weapons that we possess in our arsenals. There has to be a firm affirmation of the truth, but at the same time, a mindfulness to protect others from harm, and the two have to work together. Yes, and we can't simply, again, like the right of self-defense is there, but it can't be indulged recklessly, without limit, without proportion, without measure, because it leads to the damage of the innocents. It leads to the loss of the life of non-combatants. So the right of self-defense has to be accompanied by the duty to exercise proportionality, if I can put it that way. If somebody comes at you and just wants to clock you or give you a kick, it doesn't entitle you to blow their heads off with a shotgun. And accidents do happen sometimes.
But you can kick them back.
You may be able to kick. Certainly one is able to prevent further attack and defend oneself, but it has to be proportional. Otherwise, again, this is unbalanced desire. This is excess. This is license, and it's not just action. And it does reap a harvest that is not pleasant. We've also mentioned that whilst our institutions, the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive branch of government should reflect justice and embody justice, they don't always do that. Often they don't do that. And when they don't do that, they are less expressive of justice than they are of power relations.
It can be devastating.
Of course it can be devastating if you're on the receiving end of it. And you may have been on the receiving end of an unjust decision or an unjust action taken by an institution, or some injustice that wasn't checked and properly addressed by an institution, and you weren't given redress. So when they don't reflect and implement justice, they're usually expressing certain power relations that are aberrant. So those who have more political clout or more financial clout may in fact be tyrannising over those who don't. Now, the rights of minorities have to be protected by tyrannies of majorities wherever we go. It is so important that front and centre of our concerns for justice are those who are not very good at, who don't have the means, the wherewithal to stand up for themselves and protect themselves. They might lack the voice to even speak their concerns and their causes and their claims. Other people need to speak on their behalf. They may lack the ability to defend themselves. Others have to step in and ensure that they are protected. So a right, really, in essence, is something that sanctions the freedom of action of a minority within a social context where it is possible for a majority to tyrannise over them. And the first level, the smallest minority of all, is the minority of the individual. So we have the whole system of rights can't bypass the individual. The individual is the building block of the system of rights. And justice is something that quite naturally begins by considering the individual, their constitution, their innate freedom, and then the consequences that they face. But then in every association of individuals, you have a normal way of operating in which they should be allowed to operate, like a family. And that family should be allowed to operate unless there is an infringement of rights that's going on between the members of the family. And that's when a larger organisation steps in. And this principle of allowing each level of organisation to do its thing without too much, without intervention from the outside, but allow each natural association from the individual, the relationship, the family, the community, the state, and the nation, and then international. So we have layers of regulation. The biggest one being international law. But we've seen over and over again that this only works if people sign up to it and subscribe to it. So international laws can be proposed, and it seems like humanity is moving in the direction of having some sort of global system of law that can be subscribed to. But unless the individual governments take up on the laws and implement them, they remain essentially a toothless tiger. So it's a bit of a recap of all the different justice issues that we have talked about in this series. And we might leave it at that for this transmission.